Hello, everyone, and welcome. We will get started in just a minute. All right. We still have some people coming in, but we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, The Color of Drinking. Our presenter today is Reonda, Washington. This webinar is brought to you by the Great Lakes PTTC and SAMHSA. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are funded by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official position of DHHS or SAMHSA. The Great Lakes PTTC and the PTTC network believe that language matters and words have power. We use the use of affirming language that inspires hope in all of our activities. We have some housekeeping details for you today. If you are having technical issues, please individually message either Christina Spanbauer or Stephanie Bellman in the chat section, and they will be happy to help you. Put any questions that you have for the speaker in the Q&A section, which is also located at the bottom of the screen, and we will respond to those questions during the presentation. If you put them in the chat, we might miss them. So if possible, always put them in the Q&A section. We will be using automated transcriptions for today's webinar. You will be directed to a link at the end of the presentation to a very short survey. We would really appreciate if you could fill it out. It takes about 3 minutes and it's how we report back to SAMHSA. We are recording this session and it will be available on our website in probably a couple of weeks. Certificates of attendance will also be sent out to all who attend the full session, and those can take up to 2 weeks as well. If you would like to see what else we're up to, please follow us on social media. And again, I am very excited. Our speaker today is Reonda, Washington. Reonda is a substance abuse prevention specialist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Her work involves helping students to make healthy choices around alcohol, researching the UW alcohol culture, collaborating with campus partners to build capacity, implementing alcohol prevention programs, and data analysis. We are excited to have you, Reonda, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Reonda, Washington, and we're going to talk a little bit about a study that I have done on my campus and how it looks at the impact of the alcohol culture on specifically students of color. I always give sort of a trigger warning because I will be sharing the lived experiences of students from our campus that names violence that has happened to them, as well as violence that has happened to them because of our community. So I just want to be very mindful of that, and I will be sharing their experiences with you. So to give you a roadmap of where we're going, I'm going to talk about like influences and how we got to color of drinking on our campus. I will be sharing the color of drinking results and then our campus impact and initiatives that have resulted. We're still doing things from it. And then the summary of the findings and everything else. So for those of you that don't know, the University of Wisconsin-Madison is a predominantly white institution in Wisconsin. We're a Research 1, Division 1, and 88% of our undergraduate families are in that fourth tier of wealth. So what that means on our campus is we really don't have a middle class. There is a very distinct break between the haves and the have-nots. And we are also an urban campus that is located on an isthmus, so we have lakes, but also that wealth divide and the white divide also have dynamics for our campus. So thinking about our alcohol culture, as I mentioned, and as sort of this picture displays, we are located on an isthmus, which means we are surrounded by two lakes. 50% of our undergraduate students drink at high risk. And then students are coming to us already drinking at higher rates than everywhere else. Our police, when they do catch our students, use breathalyzers. And so we collect that data on our campus and we like to track it over time, and we have for the past since 2013. But the average BAC of someone who is transported to the detox facility, we do not run the detox facility, was 0.221. So what we see with our students, oh, for those of you that are like, what does 0.221 mean? 0.08 is the legal limit to drive. 0.221 is almost 3 times that. But what we see with our students is they tend to build a high tolerance, and we see that they are able to drink at high rates for a while. We notice that there is also this sort of entitlement factor with drinking on our campus, like it is my right to drink. That happens, and we've seen this trend continue out. So when we look at some of the environmental factors, like I said, we are on isthmus. So before the pandemic, there were 376 establishments that served or sold alcohol within the 3-mile radius of campus. Alcohol is really cheap in Wisconsin, and our state laws protect the businesses or instead of necessarily the health of people. So I use the example of an OWI. In your states, it might be called a DUI. In Wisconsin, and they're working on changing it, it's currently a misdemeanor, and you can get up to 4 before they take your license. And also within the state stats of the morbidity and mortality, Wisconsin is the number 2 binge drinking state for 18 to 44-year-olds. And then within the county health rankings, Wisconsin has 11 of the 20 places that have the drunkest place cities to live. Madison is one of those. The map that's up here that I have on the picture, the yellow dots are grocery stores, the red dots are bars. And you can see in Wisconsin, there are a higher concentration of bars. So I'm going to have the poll come up. I have a poll because we've all been dealing with different things in the community, especially with activism. So for those of you, what changes have you seen in your community due to increased racial climate before I talk about our racial climate? Okay, I see lots of protest and internal work towards being anti-racial programming. Lots of things that different places are doing as well. We've been doing a lot of these, but we had a lot of protest as well, and that's sort of depicted up here. So on our campus, we have had multiple racial incidents when we talk about racial climate on our campus. And I've put up a couple of things. These are not by any means all of the things that have been going on our campus. In 2015, we had a shooting in the community of a biracial young man by a police officer. And we started seeing activism rise, like most campuses. In the spring of 2016, we had 55 campus hate and bias incidents on our campus, where we had a young lady that got spit on. We had a young man who was arrested for the graffiti that you see in the picture in the middle of his African American Studies course by the police. We had Nazi symbols painted. We had nooses painted everywhere on campus. We had students being made fun of and mocked for a healing ceremony for survivors. That was just a really, really rough semester. And again, we've had an increase of incidents. So then that following fall at the Halloween football game, there was the noose incident where someone wore an Obama mask and someone brought a noose and put around it. Then forwarding up to more closer times, fall of 2019, we had the homecoming video incident where groups of color were invited to participate in a homecoming video. But when the video came out talking about diversity, it was all white. We had more protests happening, and then we had some graffiti, as you can see, with the UW for whites only. And so there was sort of a little bit of a race war. Flash forward to this past fall, where we had people who were protesting because of George Floyd and all of that during the semester, but then Kenosha happened, and Kenosha is the shooting of Jacob Blake. And Kenosha, Wisconsin is 2 hours from Madison, and Madison is the capital of Wisconsin, for those of you that didn't know. And so we also had protesting. And so what ended up happening was it was found out that UW-PD, the University Police Department, used university funds to help support the Kenosha protests and also the George Floyd protests where students were shot with rubber bullets this summer. So our student government had a vote of no confidence in our police department. And so that has caused more tensions. But all of these racial things have happened on our campus. And overall, our campus is not really good at dealing with our racial issues as they come and go over time. So then when we start looking at the alcohol climate meeting the racial climate, what we were seeing and what was being brought up by students, which sort of led to all of this, was we were seeing them combined, but no one was talking about it. And so here is a collection of things that we've seen over time. And I added the BIPOC Coalition because the Mifflin Street Block Party was 2 weeks ago on our camp, and even during COVID. And so what we've been seeing is that students of color are being harassed and attacked by drunk students. And no one was talking about it at the time. With the real UW, that happened in the spring of 2016, where students of color were tweeting about their experiences on campus. It was about all of their experiences, but we analyzed them. And 1 out of every 5 things that they were tweeting, yik-yakking, Facebooking about, alcohol was involved as the aggressor. And so there's been a history of this on our campus. So this was brought to my attention. So in 2013 was the first year that we started Alcohol EDU on our campus. And I went and shared our Alcohol EDU data with our student government called ASM, the people who voted the no confidence in the slide before. And they asked me a simple question, or what I thought was a simple question at the time. They're like, Ms. Washington, you shared a lot of data about the negative consequences to the drinker, but do you have any data about the negative consequences the drinker does to others, specifically discrimination and harassment? Again, knowing that alcohol and racial climate had hit. And I was like, okay, I don't, but let me just look into that. And so at the time I thought, I'm just adding an extra survey question. So I had students and we went and started looking at the literature and the research. And a lot of the research, I know most of you know this, doesn't talk about students of color, drinking. It says like it's a good way to lower white drinking, but then it doesn't really talk about secondhand impacts of drinking as climate issues. It talks about sexual assault, mental health, and accidents, but it doesn't really talk about climate issues. So it was like, okay, not finding anything that can help. So I had a student, hired her name was Melissa, and we decided we were going to do focus groups of students, different student groups of color, to sort of see what is it we're trying to get at. The focus groups, we started with the Machistas, who are a Latinx subgroup, and they told us that they didn't have time to do focus groups because they were busy students. And they're like, we'll do this if this is a survey. To which my response at the time was, are y'all going to check your email? Because students don't check their email. And they're like, we'll do it if it's a small survey within 10 minutes. So we did color of drinking. one in spring of 2015. And that was to all students of color, and I'll share that information next. So I'm going to put up another survey before I hop into the color of drinking results and some questions for you to think about as I go through that. So poll question, sorry, about how do you use data, your substance abuse use data. So most of you have a major survey that you conduct every couple of years and you look at it. There are some of you that have data that you use more consistently, and then you have access to limited data for the most part. So on our campus, we have lots of data, and I'll show you some more things that help heighten some of the results we saw. But like, again, before I hop into our results of what we found with color of drinking, think about the dynamics of your campus or the community that you work in, and what does your racial climate look like? What does your alcohol climate look like? And what data do you have that supports either? And then how do we, foster inclusive, responsive environments? So I am going to be referencing this booklet a lot, and I've pulled out some pages because we are in a webinar space where you can see some of the quotes and things from students. But this booklet is available always on our UHS website, and I will be referencing some pieces of things from that. So to talk about the two surveys, Color of Drinking 1 was done in 2015, and it was a census of our undergraduate students of color only. We got a 10.8% completion rate and no incentives were given. One of the culturally relevant things I always point out about Color of Drinking 1, it was done 2 weeks after the Tony Robinson shooting. And then Color of Drinking 2, we did in winter of 2017, so November until the new year of 2018. We did a census of all of our undergraduate students of color, and we did a sample of white undergraduate students. We had a 25.2% completion rate of our students of color and about a 17% completion rate of our white students. And all students received an Amazon $5 Amazon gift card. And Color of Drinking 2 was cited as research through IRB. Color of Drinking 1 was considered not researched by IRB. So we made sure Color of Drinking 2 was. So how I always start off Color of Drinking, or how I always start off is, and Color of Drinking is made up of a lot of qual questions, was with this qual question: describe the alcohol culture at UW-Madison. And if you are following along in the booklet, this is on pages 7, 18, and 19. And so what we found is that there are themes that emerged. For students of color, the alcohol culture is prevalent. The alcohol culture is how UW-Madison students socialize. The pressure to participate in the drinking culture is high. And then for our white students, the alcohol culture is how UW-Madison students socialize. UW-Madison alcohol culture encourages drinking heavily, and participation in the alcohol culture is dependent on who you socialize with. What I like to point out and sort of frame for all of these results as we go forward from this point is the thing that was the same between both groups. The alcohol culture is how UW-Madison students socialize. I want y'all to hold on to that as we go through some of the other results. But for those of you that don't have a booklet, here's what a page out of the book looks like, and I'll read two for you. It's strong, everywhere, encouraged, supported, expected, ridiculed, and accepted all at once. Everyone does it is a saying that applies here. Alcohol consumption is rampant across UW by students of all ages. For better or for worse, it's a cornerstone of UW. from a student of color. So then from a white student, practically every person I've met over the past 2 years drinks heavily and encourages the people around them to drink and party. I didn't drink before coming to UW, and now I feel pressure to drink every weekend. These are the frames that our students put on all of this coming forward. So to talk about the results, I'm going to talk about takeaways, and I've knocked them down to 4. And so alcohol culture influences microaggressions and retention of students of color. Students of all racial identities report feeling unsafe in high-risk drinking environments. High-risk drinking is tied to student connection and belonging, and alcohol use by white students is a protective factor for academic and social success. So the first takeaway, the alcohol culture influences microaggressions and retention of students of color. So in this survey, in both surveys from 2015 and the current one, we did ask about microaggressions, and this is how we defined it using the Su et al. Definition. And so we asked, have you experienced microaggressions at UW-Madison? And this is in pages 22 to 23 and 15 in your booklet. And in 2015, 62% said yes. And in 2017, 61.7% said yes. If you round out, it's the same number. And so what we found is that almost 2/3 of our students of color have experienced a microaggression on our campus. And because students of color are not monolithic, when we looked and broke down what this looked like, we saw that African American students had the highest rates of experiencing microaggressions on our campus. And when we do the statistical analyses, for those of you that like statistical analyses, when we do race and gender, Black women have the highest rates of experiencing microaggressions. However, if you do gender then race, it's actually Asian American women who have the highest rates of microaggressions on our campus. But then we also see that Middle Eastern and Latinx also had the next highest rates of microaggressions on our campus. And I asked from the second one about the gamut of microaggressions that they experienced. So I have been frequently confused with other South Asian students who do not look like me by intoxicated people. One time, a very drunk white guy, college student, told me he rules Saudi Arabia, where I am not from, and uses the N-word. I've heard lots of white students use the N-word. I've frequently heard people complain about their TA's accents. I've been harassed by presumable straight white men because I am queer. In Color of Drinking 1, we asked mainly about just the ones that the microaggression students experienced because of alcohol. And this one has always stuck with me. 3 words, Cinco de Mifflin. That particular weekend was the most degrading I have ever felt on university property. 3 white males were already drinking and passed out in my dorm. I was doing laundry, and they made a comment about how that's all I was good for, doing laundry. So then when we also asked about, have students considered leaving the university? This is on pages 11 in your booklet. And what we found was that students of color were 4.5 times more likely to have considered leaving the university than their white peers. And when we asked them why, students of color said racial climate was their number 1, and white students talked about academic reasons. You also see mental health as number 2 for both. But when we asked them and gave them reasons, alcohol climate is in the top 6 for both students. Now, how does that compare to our campus climate survey? Because all campuses normally have a campus climate survey. Ours is still from 2016. They asked, have you seriously considered leaving? Rates are about the same, But the reason for students of color, campus climate, is still the same reason at number 1. So talking about takeaway number 2, and I'm going to have a poll put up, possibly. Are there places in your community that your populations avoid due to high alcohol usage? Right. Majority, 75% yes. Okay. So hopping into our second takeaway, students of all racial identities report feeling unsafe in our high-risk drinking environment. Safety for students of color in high-risk drinking environments is impacted more. And so we asked this question on color drinkings 1 and 2. Do you avoid specific areas due to the concerns about alcohol use of others? And the numbers stayed about the same from 1 to 2 for students of color, but white students also felt unsafe at about 40%. But then again, when we broke it down by each group, African American students and multiracial students had some of the highest rates of avoiding areas on or off campus due to concerns about alcohol use. What became interesting was the where. For those of you that don't know our campus, majority of the chapter facilities for fraternity and sorority life are on Langdon Street. So fraternity and sorority life was number 1 for both. Langdon Street was number 2 for both. And then house parties and State Street and the bars was number 2 for both. So here's a map of our campus, the edge of our campus, because just so you have some understanding. And the stars show you Langdon Street and the other star shows you State Street. If I can get this to work today. So this is Langdon Street. And up in this area are the chapter facilities for fraternity and sorority life. This is State Street. It connects us to the Capitol. And there are lots of bars in this area. Also on Langdon Street is the Memorial Union. Our Memorial Union sells alcohol, so 70% of its sales are alcohol. And our Memorial Union Terrace is the largest outdoor bar in Wisconsin. Right beside the Memorial Union, which I know it's not marked, would be the Red Gym. The Red Gym is home to a lot of our students with marginalized identities. The Multicultural Student Center is there. The Gender Sexuality Campus Center, International Student Services is there. They all live in that building. And so then Memorial Library is in between these two places. Memorial Library is the only library on our campus that is open 24/7, or was before the pandemic. And right across the street from Memorial Library is a bar. And in Lake Street over that block, there are 218 bars. So when students are talking about Langdon Street and State Street, they run into campus and they have high alcohol outlet density. But then if someone was working late or doing something at the Union, the Red Gym, or even the library on Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, where would they have to cross, or who might they run into? So then here are some quotes from Color Drinking 1 that sort of explain that. I don't like walking by the bars on State Street or University at night. There are usually drunk people out on the street, and I don't like to get in their way. Students being scared of getting in drunk people's way. So then this is on pages 12 and 20 in your booklet. I also asked about, in Color Drinking 2, has the alcohol use impacted your health, physical, mental, overall well-being in the time you have attended Madison? And about 30% of students of color said yes, and white students had a little bit higher, but their reasonings is what's really interesting. So students of color talked more about mental health and safety, where white students talked more about physical health and social impact. And so first, from a student of color, it's sad to see my peers killing themselves. It makes me very anxious to be around or interact with much of the student body. Constant paranoia that I will be raped or sexually assaulted. I'd like to healthily consume, but I'm afraid someone will take advantage of me. Vomit makes me sad and induces anxiety. And then from a white student, I gained weight due to my drinking, which I know are not even equal situations. But then when we start looking at the other campus health data, it explains some of why these answers showed up this way. So from our Healthy Minds data from 2019, as you can see, even from the past years, almost all student of color groups have higher rates of experiencing depression than their white counterparts. The same can be said for anxiety for the most part. And then 11% experienced suicidal ideation. Students of color had higher rates of endorsing suicidal ideation than other groups. Then when we look at sexual violence, with the exception of Asian women, females of color had higher rates of experiencing victimization for sexual violence than their white counterparts. And then when we look at alcohol-facilitated sexual assault on our campus is at 77% based on our AAU results, but then also thinking about majority of victims and perpetrators were both ingesting alcohol. And going back to that beginning statement, alcohol is how UW-Madison students socialize. Which brings us to the takeaway 3. High-risk drinking is tied to student connection and belonging. So has your oh, that's right. I had a poll. That is correct. Sorry. Okay, yes. Alcohol is tied to belonging in your environments. Sorry, I did that. So we did ask, in color of drinking, has your personal alcohol use or the alcohol use of others impacted your overall sense of belonging at UW-Madison? What became interesting is that 46% of students said yes, and this is on pages 13 and 20 in your booklet if you are following along. And so sort of what they said became really interesting between the different groups of people. If you don't drink, you don't fit in at UW-Madison. Alcohol use by others makes me feel isolated, or alcohol use amplifies racial issues by students of color. From our white students, alcohol helps you fit in and belong. If you don't drink, you don't belong. Alcohol helps you meet new people. Drinking alcohol helps me feel like I belong at UW-Madison, and alcohol helps you bond with people socially. So part of other ways that we see how this plays out for our students is with the term badger. Badger is our school's mascot, but a lot of students, specifically students of color, do not want to be called a badger. They would prefer to be called a UW-Madison student. Part of that is because the image of a badger that students use is someone who is overly intoxicated. And they feel like that is not tied to feeling like they belong on their campus. So here I will read a quote from you for you. The privileged culture around drinking and the idea that it is the normal thing to do and how people have fun in college makes me feel like I'm not experiencing college the way I'm supposed to, and that I don't relate to my peers. That's from a student of color, from a white student. I feel like you're most definitely looked down upon and considered an outsider if you do not partake in the drinking culture at UW-Madison. So then this is the big thing that we've been working a lot on our campus. This is from Healthy Minds. And we took 2 belonging principles. On the vertical axis, I have a group, a community, or social circle at UW-Madison where I feel I belong, feel at home, known, connected to, supported in my identity. And then on the horizontal axis, I see myself as part of the campus community. What we did is we took all of the alcohol questions from Healthy Minds and mapped them on this axis. And what you see, the students in that upper quadrant who have higher sense of belonging are students who drink alcohol, one, who have a moderate odyssey, a high odyssey, who binged or impaired alcohol was impairing their daily life, and that's a higher level. Whereas those in that lower quadrant, alcohol didn't impair their daily life, they did not binge, they had a low odyssey, or they did not use alcohol at all. But then how does this relate to our identities? So we also did this with identities on our campus. I'm going to stop and go through the colors for you of what some of these identities look like. Green is race and ethnicity. Yellow is sexual orientation. Red is gender identity. Pink is financial stress. Purple is nationality. Blue is first generation status. And orange is registered disability. But what we see is that students with non-dominant identities are also in that lower quadrant. And we know they don't drink as much alcohol, which I'll be showing you in a little bit. But then in that upper quadrant are students with more dominant identities. So then when we look at the rest of our campus climate data, how often do you feel like you belong on our from our campus climate data? Only 50% of students of color and 75% of white students. But then when we look at how much they feel safe, welcome, respected, and excluded, students of color have lower rates of feeling safe, welcome, and respected, but higher rates of feeling excluded than their white counterparts, based on our own campus climate survey. So then that brings us to my fourth and final takeaway. Alcohol use by white students is a protective factor for academic and social success. Allowances and exemptions are made academically to support drinkers and the alcohol culture. So this is on page 8 in your booklets, but we asked about drinker type. And while there are some students of color that do partake, white students were drinking at higher rates, specifically high-risk drinking, heavy episodic and problematic drinking at higher rates than students of color, and we had more abstainers and non-drinkers in our students of color, which we see a lot. One of the things that we looked at was the Diner Flourishing Scale, which is positive well-being. And it has nothing to do with being a college student. It has nothing to do with alcohol. And we have this in Healthy Minds, which is part of why we added this here. And this is on page 10 in the booklet, if you're paying attention with the booklet. And it has things like, I lead a purposeful life. My social relationships are supportive. I'm interested in daily activities. I actively contribute to the well-being of others. I am competent in the activities that are important to me. I have a good life. I am optimistic about my future and people respect me. So what we did was we took the drinker types for both sets of students, and we took the top tier, or where 90% of flourishers based on Diner's thing are supposed to be, so the top flourishers, and mapped them. And what we saw was that for students of color, alcohol and flourishing aren't correlated. But for white students, alcohol and flourishing are correlated. And actually the problematic drinkers have the highest flourishing rates than anyone else. And we see this trend in a lot of our other data sets on our campus, in Healthy Minds, in Alcohol EDU, now in Color of Drinking, and we've had it in other places, but we started seeing this trend of On our campus, and especially for white students, alcohol and flourishing are correlated. For students of color, not so much. But then we also looked at, we're an academic institution and wanting to look at GPA and things. And so the thing here is that the students who drink versus the students who don't drink, there's not much difference in their GPA. And y'all are like, well, this is reported self GPA 1, but then it follows the grading pattern. But also the research says the more you drink, the worse your grades are supposed to be. We're not seeing that on our campus. But then let me also provide you with some actual things. I know this is 2019 data, but the average GPA of a student who was caught for an alcohol violation was 3.8. Our Greek females, who have a high risk drinking rate of 72% in our PHA and have chapter facilities, consistently have a higher women's GPA than the rest of campus. And it's something that they use to recruit. And then our high risk residence halls, we have 20 residence halls, have highest GPAs out of all of our residence halls, outdoing some with our learning communities. So we see some of this in action. So then on page 17, you'll find these questions that we asked. We asked students, have they experienced the following: having to find alternative study space because of the alcohol culture, when assigned group work or group meetings, having to schedule around the consumption of alcohol, and professors or TAs discussing alcohol in the classroom, which is not really discussing, it's making fun of, or talking about alcohol in a not great way. And that one was the one that was statistically significant for those of you that like stats. And so here are some responses for that. And the top one has gotten a lot of traction for things that we've done with faculty and staff. It has definitely made me feel awkward in the classroom when professors or TAs consistently talk about drinking and maybe having students meet up to drink. Also on page 17, we also asked about the experience of the drinkers. So since students of color didn't drink as much as white students, their numbers are a little bit lower. But being too hungover to attend class, choosing to drink instead of study, and performing poorly on an assignment are the ones that are statistically significant. Oh, I didn't, oh yeah, I guess I'm at survey debrief. I thought I had another one. So I'm going to take a minute and answer some of the Q&A questions, and then I will go to the end.
Awesome. The first one is there a breakdown of gender between these numbers? I would be interested to see the intersectionality privilege breakdowns within the different communities of color and how they can also be addressed.
We did not break down by gender all the way because there were some inconsistencies with gender between our two groups. And there was more gender variation in the students of color, but also as like one of the things, fidelity for students of color, I didn't want to find students. And so that's part of why we haven't looked all the way for a breakdown, because there was more gender variability, but it's something we're looking into. We just haven't done it yet with this data set.
Okay, thanks. The next one is, do you have any recommendation for untying alcohol use from belonging and sobriety from isolation?
So this is actually one of the things that we're focusing on right now as we're working of heading back and seeing. And the question is, like the question I've been asking is, can you untie belonging and alcohol use is the first question, which I haven't gotten an answer to yet. But then we're working on how do you amplify those voices of the non-drinkers, the students who are possibly in recovery, and the voices that are not elevated, instead of supporting the high-risk drinkers, which we're trained to do, especially in the field, as we are saying.
Great, thank you. How have the racial issues and drinking culture gone under the radar of UW-Madison?
Previously to 2013, there are like, this is like a long answer, then I got time for it, but then we have time for it. But because like previous to when I got there wasn't an alcohol person for 3 years. And then before that, we were doing PACE. And so I found information where there were things that were highlighted in 1987, but there wasn't a person doing the job to bring these issues to light. But then also, how do you address these issues? Because our field, sort of like even as I found, how do you address alcohol and racism or drinking while drunk? No, that's not something that's easily. And so, and some of it is also alcohol is political, and it wasn't beneficial to talk about race is the other reason.
That makes sense. Do you think the sense of belonging that drinking with friends and fraternity members is really what leads to good GPAs, whereas the people who are not drinking with others are lonely and having a difficult retaining information and keeping grades up?
Well, no, I'm not saying alcohol is a dependent thing. It's about access to resources. Sense of belonging gets you access to resources, and drinking is the way that we do this. There are still students who don't drink who have a good GPA. It wasn't saying that they don't have a good GPA. And we found from my non-drinker survey, because I have lots of surveys on our campus, that students who didn't drink or had come in not drinking had, like, they felt lonely, but they're like, I had my academics and I had that experience. Okay. I think I'm going to answer one more, and then I'm going to go to the end, and then I'll answer the rest.
Okay. Do you know how many students of color, do you have the number of students who answered the color of drinking surveys?
Yes, I think, and it's also in the booklet, but it was 1189, I think is the correct number. So we had 25% of our small number. So it was pretty high, 25%. So, yeah.
Okay, great. We will answer the rest of the questions at the end.
Yes. So what have we been doing with this as I do backwards things? Sorry, y'all. So the initial campus response, our University Police Department added Langdon Street to the first 45 days initiative. And so that meant they could have a presence because Langdon Street used to fall under MPD jurisdiction, and I have more on that in a little bit. Red Gym hosted the first alcohol-free event open to all students. And some of you are like, what, you didn't have alcohol-free events? This was the first one open to all students because our union sells alcohol. Events hosted there are not considered alcohol-free. Housing hosts alcohol-free events, but mostly first years live in housing, and so they're not open to students who do not live in housing. So that was really significant for us. And then housing did change some of the policies, and we've been doing more of a restorative justice policy when we're seeing environmental impact of drinking and behavior, because they're where we've seen a lot of the intersectionality of alcohol and racism. And then the Center for Leadership of Involvement, which is where fraternity and sorority life used to be, moved where the students load their buses. So FSL used to load their buses in front of the Red Gym before an event, and so, you know, pre-gaming. And so then they moved it to the end or down the street so that students wouldn't be causing problems in the Red Gym as a policy thing. And students were like, oh, we didn't realize that's why this happened. So then some of the more strategic responses, addressing the priorities in color of drinking are on our Vice Chancellor Student Affairs strategic priority list. And then for identity and inclusion, color of drinking is helping with programming and some of the strategic planning. For our fraternity and sorority life, they have been under review. I have a lot of their data, but color of drinking is one of the guiding pieces of the outcome. And then the Langdon Street Coalition has been formed, and there is a Langdon Street liaison officer. And so it's Langdon Street, sort of a town and gown thing, because Langdon Street goes all the way to Edgewater, which is part of town. And so trying to make Langdon Street safer for everybody and address some of the issues also for the facilities that do have chapters or chapter facilities, addressing some of the race issues and trainings and all of those pieces. The Student Involvement Coalition in the homecoming review, they've used that. And then color of drinking data is used in our Healthy Academics Toolkit, which we use to help support faculty in training. And like my colleague, Dr. Barrett, does our academics side, because we have that position in our office, and does a lot of trainings and tools with our faculty and staff, and color of drinking is included in that. So students have utilized the data to advocate for our Wisconsin which is the now mandatory first year program that from 2016. The MSC advocated using color of drinking of 2 and got the APITA and Latinx cultural centers. We had a Black cultural center and there was an Indigenous one. I think that might have gotten taken away with the pandemic. And then the color of drinking was incorporated into our alcohol programming for Badger Step Up, which is required for all RSOs, registered student organizations. Sort of the place I didn't see it as much because alcohol, like I said, is political on our campus. So I didn't see as much alcohol movement, but there was more on the DEI side. So here is our Associate Vice Chancellor, Student Affairs of Identity and Inclusion, who was here through all 2 color of drinkings, talking about sort of the impact of color of drinking on our campus, using quotes from people from campus, because I like qual a little bit, but how it also has elevated the voices of our students of color. And then sort of the bullet points of some of those other things that aren't seen and that aren't measurable of things that it's done. We got our campus administration to be able to talk about alcohol. It garnered attention. It gave them the roadmap to talk about alcohol and climate. We are working with faculty and staff to reevaluate practices in the classroom. It's helped us talk about health equity and allocation of resources. And really, like, why are we focusing all of our resources on the high-risk drinkers? There are still things that are there for them, but then how are we looking at those students who aren't our high-risk drinkers and their needs? Elevated the voices of needs of our marginalized students and has laid the groundwork for their intersectionality of issues, conversations, and practices. All right, the questions, thoughts, and reactions.
Okay, we'll start with questions. And someone said, also, why isn't the red gym on the map? It seems like leaving that off a school map is a huge red flag about the campus.
On our school map, it's there. This one wasn't, this was just the one I could get of like the end of Langdon Street and State Street for the purposes of showing Lang Street and State Street. On our school map, the red gym is there. Trust me.
Okay. I wonder if healthy choices / behaviors could be encouraged in the younger years so that when they arrive at UW, there would be a change in the culture of drinking to more non-drinking students.
There have been some things. I know a lot of our schools, our feeder schools within the state of Wisconsin, they do ASTP. And what we've been seeing is, at least within the past 2 years, is students coming from Wisconsin are drinking less, but we've been incorporating students from out of state as well, and they've been drinking more coming in. And so that also feeds in. And also from our state YRBSS, again, we've been seeing that shift of students drinking later, but then again, once they come into our environment and the college effect, sometimes that disproportionately impacts.
Okay. Are the majority of students who took the survey local from within the state, or did you measure that?
So we did not ask students where they were from, but since our students, we asked an array of students. I can't tell you because we didn't ask our students of color for the survey. But then for the state of Wisconsin, over 50% of our students are local. 60 to 40 is normally the breakdown of students from Wisconsin versus everywhere else.
Okay, thanks. So another question is, as far as restorative justice, what kinds of programming are you requiring students to complete?
I don't know all the answers to that because I'm not as involved with the restorative justice practices, but our Dean of Students has been going through for the past, I think, 5 years and incorporating restorative justice practices, and they've just completed this big training. And so that's been part of, like, housing is also a conduct body. So that's why I'm saying all of that. And so I can't tell you exactly what programming they're doing, but I know that that's been like a big initiative for our school from all of those.
Okay. Someone also commented that, you know, people will do things and say things that they wouldn't have done if the inhibition hadn't been reduced by alcohol. Has that been shown in studies?
Yes, that's been shown in multiple studies, and we can even show it within our data by like one of my another study that I have is our detox study, where we ask students like, did your peers pressure you to drink before anything happened? And they're like, no, my peers didn't pressure me to do anything. So then we get further on in it, we're like, okay, so what other things could you have been doing besides drinking? They're like, well, they can always name something, but then they're like, I wouldn't have been drinking if my friends hadn't gotten me to this point. And so if they're being transferred to drink detox, they're drinking more. And then they didn't perceive that they're drinking. 80% of our own students from our own data didn't perceive that their drinking put them at risk. So that, you know, we've seen that, but then there are some studies that have shown like inhibitions, you know, you wouldn't have done things. So we know like the belonging piece in our environment, sorry, I'm rambling, would have encountered that.
Great, thank you. Couple more questions. Does the university have any policies around alcohol use on campus? And what is the average age of students?
The average age of our students, I believe, depending on which school you're looking at, the average age of our students is 19 for our undergraduates because we have a higher thing. But then like for our graduate students and professional students, I want to say it's like 33. But then for policies, we do have policies like for student orgs, for like if people serve alcohol at events, whether faculty, staff, they have to go through like an alcohol beverage service policy training. And so they do have that when it's being used on campus, since our union does serve alcohol. There are like, we do not have alcohol-free housing and all of that. We've been trying to get out. We're like, you could make this policy and this would be so much easier. We've lost the alcohol floor, but like some of the environmental policies are harder to impact because there are bars like right across the street from the university.
Right. Yeah. So have you noticed differences between the BIPOC and white students in student conduct penalties for those with alcohol related offenses?
Sometimes the impact of the conduct offenses is worse. Not saying that students of color all get scholarships, you know, 66% are on scholarship. So if they get an alcohol violation, they can lose their scholarship, while some of our white students don't necessarily, like their parents will pay the fine, they're not necessarily losing their scholarship or their chance for an education. And so that's more of where it becomes uneven. For alcohol, and I say this lovingly, like sometimes conduct, like they get 3 chances basically, and sometimes more with alcohol. So that's is judicious across. That's one issue area that I'm like, raise things as equitable, but the impact sometimes is not. Like with all the fines and things, that adds up to like 1,000 plus. If they get sent to detox, that's almost $2,000. And sometimes that's not equitable for like people to be able to pay in general, but then for students of color, on top of if they're a scholarship, it puts them in more straits.
Right. Yeah, I didn't realize it was that expensive. Overall, Wisconsin's drinking culture needs to change, not only for students, but also for the general public. A blood alcohol level from 0.08 to lower. Do you think that that would work? Or then this could be a political issue with lobbyists?
It is a political issue. Also in Wisconsin, I don't know if you know, we have this thing called the Tavern League, which is a lobbying group to keep the bars open, which also is part of the problem. And like, so it is all political. And like, I think like even 2 years ago, there was like a resolution by one of the senators to be like, we want to lower the drinking age back to 18. So sometimes it's all very political. And like one of my colleagues, Julia Sherman, who does the alcohol policy work, like had to take off work to go testify because it's political and she had to do it on her own time. Very, very contentious. And
Right.
the recovery community, we're starting one. We are actually in the process of doing one, and we have now taken it over. We're building it, but it's taking processes and steps. So we actively have a recovery community called Badger Recovery that is now being built.
That's great. That's great. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we are at 2 o'clock. You were able to answer all of those questions perfectly. Thank you. So your contact information is up on the slide. Those slides will also be available on our website in about a week to 10 days. You can find all of that information there. I want to thank all of you for your time, and especially you, Reonda, for your really great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.